She found it at the bottom of a donation bin, half buried beneath stained linens and broken picture frames. $1. That's what the tag said. One single dollar for something that looked like it had survived a house fire and a flood. But Sarah Chen didn't have the luxury of being picky anymore. When you're counting pennies to buy bread, when your daughter asks why Santa might skip your house this year, when the eviction notice is taped to your door in bright orange shame, you stop seeing trash as trash. You start seeing possibility. This is a story about desperation, about a discovery that shouldn't have been possible, and about wealth hidden so carefully that 3 generations missed it completely. Watch until the end. Subscribe and write in the comments where you're watching from and what you would do with a second chance. The thrift store smelled the way thrift stores always did, like decades of other people's lives compressed into cramped aisles and fluorescent lighting. Sarah had been coming here every Thursday for 6 months, timing her visits for when they marked down items that hadn't sold. She'd learned the rhythm of survival shopping. The best finds came from the donation bins before they were priced and sorted, before anyone else decided what had value. She was 32 years old, though some mornings she felt 60. Her hands, once smooth from office work and expensive hand cream, were now rough from cleaning houses, from scrubbing other people's toilets, from doing laundry in bathtubs because the apartment building's machines cost $3 per load. $3 that could buy a half-gallon of milk. $3 that meant her daughter Emma could have cereal for breakfast instead of just toast. The music box sat wedged between a box of mismatched silverware and a garbage bag full of shoes. Sarah almost missed it. She was reaching for what looked like a decent winter coat, something Emma desperately needed, when her hand brushed against carved wood. Cold, dense, unfamiliar. She pulled it free carefully, and a small cloud of dust rose into the air. It was ugly. That was Sarah's first thought. Not charmingly vintage, not rustic, just ugly. The wood was dark, almost black in places, water-stained and cracked. The carved details, flowers maybe, or vines, were so worn down they looked like scars. The brass hardware had turned green with age, and one of the hinges hung loose, barely attached. When Sarah turned it over, checking for a price, yellowed masking tape on the bottom read simply, $1. Donation bin clearance. $1. She had exactly $4.63 in her wallet, money she'd earned, cleaning the Martinez family's house yesterday. That $4.63 needed to last until Saturday, when she got paid again. She needed bread. She needed peanut butter. She needed to put gas in her car so she could drive to her 3 cleaning jobs and the weekend shift at the diner. But something made her pause. Maybe it was the weight of the box, heavier than it should have been for its size. Maybe it was the intricacy of the carving beneath the damage, suggesting it had once been beautiful. Maybe it was just the desperate hope that anything, even garbage, might contain something worth more than $1. You taking that? The voice belonged to Marcus, the store manager, a kind man in his 60s, who always looked the other way when Sarah lingered too long in the warmth of the store on cold days. Sarah looked up. I'm thinking about it. Marcus walked over, his knees creaking. He picked up the music box, turned it in his hands, and made a face. Came in yesterday with a whole estate lot. Old lady passed, no family claimed anything. Mostly junk. You want it? Take it. Consider it 50 cents. Sarah's heart beat a little faster. 50 cents saved was 50 cents earned. Does it work? The music box part? Marcus tried to open it. The lid stuck, swollen from water damage, then gave way with a protesting crack. Inside, the velvet lining had rotted away to threads. The mechanical workings were visible. Tarnished brass cylinders and pins covered in something that might have been rust or dried adhesive. He tried to wind the key on the bottom. It turned stiffly, grinding. but no music came out. "Broken," Marcus said, setting it down. "Probably been broken for decades. Still want it?" Sarah should have said no. She should have walked away, bought the bread and peanut butter, been responsible. But she was so tired of being responsible. So tired of making the smart choice that kept her exactly where she was, trapped in an endless cycle of barely enough. 50 cents, she said, pulling out her wallet. Marcus smiled gently. "You're a good mom, Sarah. Emma's lucky." The words hit harder than they should have. Sarah took the music box, wrapped it in the plastic bag Marcus offered, and walked out into the November cold. Snow threatened in the gray sky. Her car, a 1998 Honda Civic with a passenger door that didn't lock and heat, that worked only intermittently, sat at the far edge of the lot. She'd parked there to avoid taking a closer spot from actual customers. Emma was waiting at Sarah's sister Michelle's house, where she stayed after school until Sarah finished work. Michelle had been patient, understanding, generous with her time and her dinner invitations. But Sarah felt the weight of that charity every day. Michelle had married well, had a house with a finished basement and a refrigerator that made ice automatically. She'd offered to let Sarah and Emma move in a dozen times, but Sarah wouldn't. There was a difference between accepting help and becoming a permanent burden. Sarah set the music box on the passenger seat and drove across town. The box shifted slightly with each turn, that strange heaviness making it slide despite its small size. She glanced at it occasionally, wondering what she'd been thinking. A broken music box, 50 cents she couldn't afford to waste. When she pulled up to Michelle's pristine suburban home, Emma was already watching from the front window. At 7 years old, her daughter had learned to recognize the sound of their car, could distinguish its particular rattle from every other vehicle on the street. The front door opened before Sarah could get out. "Mama!" Emma ran down the driveway, coat unzipped, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. Sarah caught her, held her close, breathing in the scent of Michelle's expensive shampoo that Emma had used during her after-school bath. "Hey, baby, good day?" Emma nodded against Sarah's shoulder, then pulled back. "Aunt Michelle made lasagna. She saved you some." There it was, the kindness that felt like pity. Sarah forced a smile. That was nice of her. Michelle appeared in the doorway, arms crossed against the cold, her expression warm but careful. They'd had versions of the same conversation 100 times. Michelle wanted to help more. Sarah wanted to need help less. The balance between them was delicate, held together by love and the shared memory of growing up with nothing. Before Michelle's marriage had lifted her into security Sarah could barely imagine. "There's plenty," Michelle called. "Come in, warm up." "I can't," Sarah said, the lie automatic. "Early shift tomorrow." Michelle's face fell slightly. She knew what Sarah was doing. They both did. "Sarah, thank you for watching Emma." "Really?" Sarah took her daughter's hand and started toward the car. "What's that?" Emma had spotted the plastic bag on the passenger seat. "Just something from the thrift store. You can look at it when we get home." The drive to their apartment took 12 minutes. Sarah counted every light, every stop sign, calculating gas consumption. The apartment building was a 3-story walk-up in the part of town where sirens were normal and grocery stores had bars on the windows. Their unit was on the 3rd floor, at the end of a dim hallway that always smelled like cigarettes and curry and something else Sarah had never been able to identify. Inside, the apartment was clean because Sarah couldn't bear to live in disorder, but sparse. The furniture was secondhand, collected piece by piece from curbs and clearance sections. Emma's bedroom had a bed, a small dresser, and toys organized in milk crates. Sarah's room held a mattress on the floor, a lamp, and garbage bags full of clothes that served as a closet. The kitchen had dishes for two, pots and pans that didn't quite fit on the ancient stove, and a refrigerator that hummed loudly but inconsistently. The eviction notice was still on the door. Sarah had pulled it off when they left that morning, but the residue of the tape remained, a ghostly orange rectangle that reminded her they had 30 days. 30 days to come up with $800 in back rent. 30 days before she and Emma had nowhere to go. Emma went straight to the plastic bag. "Can I see it now?" Sarah set down her purse, hung up their coats, and nodded. "Be careful. It's old." Emma pulled out the music box with both hands, her face scrunching slightly. "It's heavy." "I know. And kind of ugly." Sarah laughed, the first real laugh she'd had in days. "Yeah, it is." They sat together on the worn couch, and Emma turned the box over in her hands, examining it with the unself-conscious curiosity of a child. "What's it supposed to do?" "It's a music box. You wind this key," Sarah demonstrated, "and it's supposed to play music, but it's broken." Emma tried anyway, winding the key with both hands. It moved stiffly, grinding against years of neglect. She turned it as far as it would go, then released it. The mechanism inside made a clicking sound, labored and irregular, but no melody emerged. Just that grinding, that sense of something trying and failing to work. "Maybe it's too old," Emma said philosophically. "Maybe." Sarah took the box and examined it more carefully. In better light, away from the fluorescent glare of the thrift store, she could see that the carving was more detailed than she'd initially thought. The pattern wasn't random. It was musical notation, she realized. Staffs and notes carved into the wood, circling the box in an endless spiral. Between the staffs were words in a language she didn't recognize. German, maybe, or Dutch. The box itself was larger than typical music boxes, about the size of a thick hardcover book. The wood was some kind of dark hardwood, walnut possibly, though it was hard to tell beneath the water damage and age. The brass hardware, beneath the tarnish, showed evidence of skilled metalwork. This hadn't been cheap when it was made. Someone had commissioned this, had paid for craftsmanship and detail. "Why would someone throw this away?" Emma asked. "I don't know, baby. Maybe they didn't know what it was. Or maybe it's been broken so long nobody remembered it could be fixed." That night, after Emma was asleep, Sarah sat at their tiny kitchen table with the music box in front of her. She'd made a dinner of rice and canned vegetables, stretching the ingredients to ensure Emma got the larger portion. Her own stomach still felt hollow, but she'd learned to ignore that feeling. It had become background noise, as constant as traffic. She'd tried searching online for information about the box, but her phone's data was limited, and the search results vague. Antique music boxes ranged wildly in value. Some sold for $20. Others, rare examples from famous makers, could be worth thousands. But identifying them required expertise Sarah didn't have, and the nearest antique appraiser was 40 miles away. Even if she could get there, the appraisal fee would cost more than she could afford to lose. She picked up the box again, feeling that strange weight. It was dense in a way that seemed wrong for a hollow wooden container. She shook it gently. Something shifted inside, but it wasn't the loose rattle of broken parts. It was heavier, more solid. Sarah examined the box more carefully, running her fingers along every seam and edge. The construction was seamless, dovetailed joints that had held perfectly despite age and moisture. But there, at the back corner, nearly invisible beneath grime and old finish, was something odd. A small inconsistency in the wood grain. She scratched at it gently with her fingernail and felt the faintest give. It wasn't wood. It was a panel, disguised to look like wood, but actually something else. Metal, maybe, or reinforced composite. Her heart began to beat faster. She got a butter knife from the drawer and carefully worked it into the seam. The panel resisted, then gave way suddenly with a soft click. A section of the back wall, perhaps 2 inches square, swung inward on a tiny hidden hinge. Behind it was darkness, a cavity within the box that shouldn't have existed. Sarah tilted the box toward the light, peering inside. She saw metal. Brass cylinders, but not the music mechanism. These were tubes, sealed at both ends, stacked carefully inside a hidden compartment that occupied most of the box's interior. The music mechanism was just the outer shell. A clever disguise for what lay beneath. Sarah's hands trembled as she carefully removed one cylinder. It was heavier than she expected, cold and dense. Each end was sealed with wax, and scratched into the brass surface was a single word: songs. There were more. She counted them carefully. 18 cylinders in total, each identical in size, each sealed, each labeled with a single word or name she didn't recognize. Songs. Leipzig. Winter. Unfinished. The labels meant nothing to her, but someone had thought they were important enough to hide, to seal, to preserve in this elaborate wooden vault. Sarah sat back, her mind racing. This wasn't just a broken music box. This was a container, purpose-built to hide something. But what? And why? The question kept her awake long after she should have been asleep. She lay on her mattress on the floor, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the woman who'd died, whose estate had been liquidated, whose possessions had been judged worthless by family who didn't claim them. Had that woman known what the box contained? Had she been the one to hide it? Or had she inherited it unknowingly, the same way Sarah just had? The next morning, Sarah woke to Emma's voice calling from the living room. "Mama, it's cold." The heat had gone out again. Sarah pulled on a sweater and found Emma bundled in blankets on the couch, the music box sitting on the coffee table in front of her. In the morning light streaming through their window, the box looked different. Less decrepit, more mysterious. "Can we try to fix it?" Emma asked. Sarah made them breakfast, instant oatmeal with the last of their brown sugar, and considered the question. She didn't have money to pay someone to repair the box. She didn't have money for anything beyond the most immediate necessities. In 3 days, she'd need to come up with $200 for the partial rent payment she'd promised the landlord, a temporary measure to buy more time before the full eviction. But those cylinders, those hidden, sealed cylinders, something about them felt important, significant, not just monetarily, though her desperate mind couldn't help but hope for that, but historically. Whoever had made this box, whoever had hidden these items inside it, had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure they survived. "We can try," Sarah said finally, "but we have to be careful. Very, very careful." After dropping Emma at school, Sarah didn't go straight to her first cleaning job. Instead, she made a detour she couldn't afford, driving to the public library downtown. Gas money she didn't have, time she shouldn't spare. But the question had taken root and wouldn't let go. The library was warm, blessedly warm, and Sarah spent 20 minutes just letting the heat soak into her bones before approaching the reference desk. The librarian, a middle-aged woman with reading glasses on a chain, looked up with a professional smile. "I need help researching something," Sarah said. "An antique. I don't know where to start." The librarian's smile warmed. "Let's see what we can figure out together." It took 2 hours. 2 hours Sarah should have spent working, earning money she desperately needed. But by the time she left, she had photocopies, printouts, and a growing sense that the music box was far more than it appeared. The carved text on the box was German. The librarian, who'd spent a year studying in Berlin, had translated fragments. "The frost writes her unfinished songs. What winter berries, Spring does not always find. The phrases were poetic, melancholic, suggesting the box itself was a memorial to something lost. More importantly, Sarah had identified the maker's mark, nearly invisible beneath the grime, a tiny stamp on the brass key housing, F.W., Leipzig, 1937. Friedrich Werner. The librarian had found references in a database of European craftsmen. Werner had been a master instrument maker in Leipzig, Germany, known for creating elaborate music boxes for wealthy patrons in the 1930s. His workshop had been destroyed during the war. Most of his creations had been lost. The year 1937. Nazi Germany. The growing darkness before the war began. Sarah drove to her first cleaning job with the information churning in her mind. Leipzig, 1937. Hidden cylinders. Songs. The pieces suggested a story, but she couldn't yet see its shape. She spent the day scrubbing bathrooms and mopping floors, her body moving automatically, while her mind returned again and again to the box. By the time she picked up Emma from Michelle's house, she'd made a decision. "I need to ask you something," Sarah said to her sister, standing in the doorway instead of retreating immediately. Michelle's face lit up with cautious hope. "Of course. Anything. Do you still have those contacts? From your husband's work?" Michelle's husband worked in art authentication and historical preservation. Sarah had met some of his colleagues at family gatherings before everything fell apart. "Yes." "Why?" Sarah hesitated, then pulled out her phone and showed Michelle a photo of the music box. "I found this. I think it might be important. I need someone who knows about historical artifacts to look at it. Someone who won't—" She paused, choosing words carefully. "Someone who won't take advantage." Michelle studied the photo, her expression growing serious. "Sarah, where did you get this?" "Thrift store, $1. Sarah watched her sister's face. "I know it looks like trash, but there are things hidden inside. Sealed tubes. I think they're from before World War II. I think whoever made this was hiding something that mattered." Michelle was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded. "David knows someone, a specialist in displaced European artifacts. Let me make a call." The specialist's name was Dr. Heinrich Volker, and he agreed to meet Sarah on a Sunday afternoon at a small conservation lab affiliated with the university. Michelle had made the introduction carefully, explaining Sarah's situation without revealing too much, and Dr. Volker had responded with cautious interest tempered by professional skepticism. Sarah understood. People probably brought him treasures every week, convinced they'd found something valuable in their grandmother's attic. The lab was located in a converted industrial building near the river, the kind of space that had once housed machinery and now held delicate instruments and climate-controlled rooms. Sarah arrived 15 minutes early, the music box wrapped carefully in a towel and placed inside a canvas bag. Emma was with Michelle for the afternoon, a favor Sarah had accepted only because this felt too important to rush through while managing a 7-year-old's natural curiosity. Dr. Volker met her in the lobby. He was older than Sarah expected, perhaps 70, with careful hands and eyes that seemed to assess everything with equal attention. His accent was slight, but present, German softened by decades in America. "Mrs. Chen," he said, extending his hand. "Ms. Chen," Sarah corrected gently. "Thank you for seeing me." Michelle spoke highly of your discovery. She also mentioned you are in difficult circumstances. His directness was startling. "I want to be clear from the beginning. Most items people bring to me have sentimental value, occasionally historical interest, but rarely significant monetary worth. I do not want to raise false hopes." "I understand," Sarah said. "I just need to know what it is." He led her through a security door and down a hallway lined with photographs of restored artifacts, paintings, manuscripts, sculptures. The conservation lab itself was a large, open room filled with workstations, each equipped with magnifying lamps, tools, and reference materials. Only one other person was present, a young woman working on what looked like a damaged book, carefully separating pages that had been fused by water damage. Dr. Volker gestured to a clear workspace near the window. "Please, show me what you have found." Sarah unwrapped the music box carefully, setting it on the white surface of the examination table. In this environment, surrounded by the tools of professional analysis, the box looked even more decrepit than it had in her apartment. Water-stained, cracked, its brass hardware green with age. She felt a flutter of embarrassment. This was trash. She'd wasted this man's time. But Dr. Volker's expression changed the moment he saw it. The polite skepticism vanished, replaced by something sharper. Alert. He reached for a pair of white cotton gloves from a nearby drawer and pulled them on before touching the box. "Where did you acquire this?" His voice was carefully neutral, but Sarah heard the tension beneath it. "Thrift store, donation bin. It came from an estate sale, I think. An old woman who died. No family claimed her things." "And you paid?" 50 cents. Dr. Volker lifted the box with both hands, feeling its weight, and something flickered across his face. Recognition. He turned it slowly, examining every surface. His finger traced the carved musical notation. Following the spiral pattern around the box, when he reached the carved German text, he paused, reading silently. "The frost writes her unfinished songs," he murmured. "What winter berries, spring does not always find." He looked at Sarah. "You know what this means." The librarian translated it for me. I researched the maker's mark. Friedrich Werner, Leipzig, 1937. "You have done your homework." Dr. Volker set the box down and retrieved a magnifying glass with a built-in light. He examined the maker's mark closely, then the hinges, then the seams of the construction. Friedrich Werner. Yes, I know this name. He made perhaps 200 pieces in his career, most destroyed during the war. Only a handful are known to have survived. He straightened. "This is extraordinary craftsmanship." "But you said there was something inside." Sarah showed him the hidden panel, the way it clicked open to reveal the cavity. Dr. Volker's breath caught audibly when he saw the brass cylinders stacked within. "Mein Gott," he whispered. He looked at Sarah, his face pale. "You opened this already. You touched these?" "I wore gloves, kitchen gloves, but gloves. I was careful. And the seals, the wax? Still intact. I didn't open them. I didn't know what they were." Dr. Volker carefully removed one cylinder, holding it as though it were made of glass. He examined the wax seal, the scratched label, the patina of the brass. His hands trembled slightly. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Ms. Chen, do you understand what you may have found? Old music recordings, maybe? Or documents? Possibly." He set the cylinder down with infinite care. But the context suggests something far more specific. Friedrich Werner did not simply make music boxes. In the years before the war, he was commissioned by certain families, Jewish families primarily, to create containers, hidden containers, places to preserve things that mattered when everything else was being taken away. The words settled heavily in the room. Sarah felt something cold move through her chest. Dr. Volker continued, his voice steady but strained. In 1937, the situation in Germany was deteriorating rapidly. The Nuremberg laws had stripped Jewish citizens of their rights. Properties were being seized, businesses destroyed, families preparing for the worst. Some tried to protect what they could, not just valuables, though yes, sometimes jewelry or documents were hidden, but also culture, music, poetry. art. The things that defined who they were, that the Nazis wanted to erase completely. He touched the box again, gently. Werner was known to help. He would create these elaborate music boxes, fully functional on the surface, but with hidden compartments inside. The music mechanism was real, would actually play if wound, but beneath it was space for preservation. A family could entrust their treasures to him, and he would seal them inside, disguise them as ordinary objects, sometimes even destroy his own records to protect his clients. Sarah's throat felt tight. So these cylinders, I cannot say for certain without proper analysis, but given the context, the date, the method of preservation, these could be musical compositions, original manuscripts perhaps, reduced and preserved in a format that could survive, or recordings of performances that no longer exist anywhere else. Leipzig was a center of musical culture. It was also home to many Jewish musicians, composers, families, whose entire legacies were destroyed. He looked at Sarah directly. If these cylinders contain what I think they might, if they represent lost works from composers who did not survive the Holocaust, then you are not holding a valuable antique. You are holding history that was supposed to be erased, music that was meant to disappear forever. The room was silent except for the soft hum of climate control and the distant sound of traffic outside. Sarah stared at the brass cylinders, at these small, sealed containers that had survived against impossible odds, hidden inside a music box that someone had thrown away. "What do we do?" she asked quietly. Dr. Volker removed his gloves carefully. "First, we document everything. The box itself, its condition, its provenance as far as we can trace it. Then we contact specialists in preservation and authentication. These seals should be opened only in a controlled environment by experts who can properly analyze and protect what's inside. This will take time." "How much time?" "Weeks, certainly. Possibly months. The process cannot be rushed." He paused. "Ms. Chen, I must also be honest with you. This kind of discovery brings complications. If these items prove to be significant, there will be questions about ownership, about repatriation to surviving family members or institutions. The legal and ethical considerations are complex." Sarah felt the familiar weight of reality settling back onto her shoulders. "You're saying it might not be mine to sell. I'm saying that we do not yet know what this is or who it truly belongs to. But I am also saying," he met her eyes with unexpected kindness, "that you have potentially saved something irreplaceable, that has value beyond money, though I understand that statement does little to help your immediate circumstances." Sarah nodded slowly. She'd allowed herself to hope, just for a moment, that this might be her way out. The thing that would solve everything, that would mean Emma could stay in her school, that they wouldn't have to move again, that Sarah could stop scrubbing toilets and start sleeping at night without her stomach knotted in anxiety. But of course it was more complicated. Everything was always more complicated. "Can you continue the research?" she asked. "Can you find out what's really in there?" "Yes. With your permission, I would like to bring in colleagues. We will need to X-ray the cylinders without opening them, analyze the materials, search historical records for any documentation of this specific piece. It will require resources, but this is exactly the kind of project institutions fund." "And me? What do I do?" "You wait, you protect the box, and you prepare yourself for what comes next, which may be interest from many directions. Museums, historians, potentially legal representatives, if surviving family members are identified." He smiled faintly. "Also journalists. If this proves to be what I believe it is, the story will attract attention." Sarah left the lab 2 hours later with the music box still in her possession, but now accompanied by detailed photographs, measurements, and documentation. Dr. Volker had made careful notes, treated the box with a preservation solution to stabilize the wood, and given Sarah specific instructions about storage. Keep it cool, dry, away from direct sunlight. Handle it minimally. Wait. The drive back to her apartment felt surreal. The box sat on the passenger seat in its canvas bag, exactly where it had been on the drive over. But everything felt different now. This wasn't just an object. It was a witness. A survivor of something so vast and terrible that Sarah could barely comprehend its scope. She thought about the woman who had died, whose estate had been liquidated, whose family hadn't claimed her belongings. Had that woman known? Had she understood what she possessed, or had it been passed down to her without explanation, the way Sarah had found it? How many hands had this box passed through, carrying its secret forward through decades, waiting for someone to recognize what it held? Emma was waiting with Michelle when Sarah arrived. Her daughter ran to her immediately, chattering about the movie they'd watched and the cookies they'd baked. Normal, beautiful, 7-year-old concerns. Sarah held her close and felt the weight of two different kinds of responsibility. The responsibility to protect her daughter, to provide for her, to give her stability and safety. And now, unexpectedly, the responsibility to protect something that belonged not to her, but to history. Michelle pulled Sarah aside while Emma gathered her things. David called. Dr. Volker contacted him already. Sarah, he thinks this is real. He thinks you found something genuinely important. I know. He also said it's complicated. I know that too. Michelle studied her sister's face. You're not going to be able to sell it right away, are you? You're going to have to wait while they authenticate it and figure out the legal status. Probably. And the rent? The eviction? Sarah felt something inside her crack slightly. She'd been holding it together, staying focused, refusing to break. But standing in her sister's warm, safe house, looking at Michelle's concerned face, the reality overwhelmed her. I don't know. I don't know how we're going to make it. Michelle reached out and took Sarah's hands. Move in with us, please, just until this gets sorted out. David and I have the space. Emma can have the guest room. You can take the office. It's not charity, Sarah. It's family. I can't. Yes, you can, and you will, because your daughter needs stability, and you need time to figure out what happens next with this discovery. Stop being so stubborn and let someone help you. Sarah wanted to argue, to insist she could handle it alone, but the words wouldn't come. She was so tired, so desperately, endlessly tired of fighting every single day just to stay in place. Okay, she whispered. Just for a little while. That night, in their sparse apartment for one of the last times, Sarah sat with the music box on the kitchen table, while Emma slept. She'd done what Dr. Volker suggested, and searched online for any information about Werner's work, about music boxes from Leipzig, about cultural preservation during the Holocaust. The articles she found were heartbreaking. Stories of families desperately trying to save some fragment of their lives before everything was taken. A violin buried in a basement, sheet music sewn into coat linings, photographs hidden in false-bottom suitcases, and sometimes objects like this. Beautiful, functional things that appeared ordinary, but contained extraordinary secrets. She found one reference that made her stop scrolling. An article from a historical journal about a Werner music box that had been recovered in the 1970s. It had contained miniaturized manuscripts, reduced photographically, and sealed in protective tubes. The contents had been compositions by a Jewish composer named Samuel Rothstein, pieces that had been performed only once before Rothstein was deported to Auschwitz in 1943. He had not survived, but his music had. Hidden inside a music box that his sister had smuggled to Switzerland before the borders closed. The Rothstein box was now in a museum in Berlin. The compositions had been restored, performed, recorded. A legacy that had survived because someone had been clever enough to hide it and careful enough to protect it. Sarah touched her box gently. 18 cylinders, 18 sealed secrets. How many voices might be inside? How many melodies that the world thought were lost forever? Her phone buzzed. A text from Dr. Volker, sent late despite the hour. I have contacted colleagues at the Institute for Holocaust Studies and the Center for Jewish Music. Both expressed immediate interest. We will move forward carefully. You have done something remarkable, Miss Chen. Do not lose faith. Sarah read the message twice, then set her phone down. Do not lose faith. She'd been operating on very little faith for a long time now, running on determination and desperation rather than hope. But maybe this was a kind of faith, the belief that something broken could still have value, that something discarded could still matter, that even in the darkest moments, some things survived. The next few weeks passed in a strange duality. Outwardly, Sarah's life continued its difficult trajectory. She and Emma moved into Michelle's guest room, a process that required Sarah to swallow her pride with every box she carried through her sister's front door. She continued working her cleaning jobs and diner shifts, though Michelle insisted on covering groceries and refused to accept rent. The eviction was dropped. The apartment surrendered. Sarah's belongings, what little she owned, fit in Michelle's garage. But beneath that surface struggle, something else was unfolding. Dr. Volker worked quickly, assembling a team of specialists who treated the music box with the reverence usually reserved for items in major museums. Sarah attended meetings when she could, sitting in rooms with people who had multiple degrees and spoke in specialized vocabularies she barely understood. The X-rays revealed what Dr. Volker had suspected. The cylinders contained tightly rolled materials, papers, or parchment, sealed in layers of protective wax and resin. The process used was consistent with methods known to have been employed by Werner in his preservation work. Preliminary analysis suggested the papers dated to the late 1930s. Chemical testing of the wax seal confirmed the time period, but no one would open the cylinders yet. The process required facilities that could control humidity, temperature, light exposure. The papers inside, if they existed, would be fragile beyond measure. One mistake could destroy something irreplaceable. Sarah found herself caught in a web of organizations that wanted to be involved. The Holocaust Museum wanted to examine the box. The Center for Jewish Music wanted access to whatever compositions might be inside. University archivists wanted to study Werner's construction techniques. And then there were the lawyers. Because Dr. Volker had been right. Questions of ownership were complicated. If the box contained works by identified composers, did their estates have claims? Did it matter that Sarah had purchased the box legally? What about the woman who had died, whose possessions had been liquidated? Had she acquired the box legally? Or had it been stolen at some point during or after the war, part of the vast looting that had scattered Jewish property across continents? Sarah sat through meetings with lawyers who explained, in careful language, that she might not be entitled to any financial compensation, even though she'd found the box. Cultural patrimony laws, repatriation protocols, the specific legal status of Holocaust-era artifacts. It was dizzying, frustrating, and deeply unfair in ways that made Sarah's jaw clench with anger she couldn't express. She'd found this. She'd recognized its value when everyone else saw trash. She'd protected it, researched it, brought it to people who could help. And now there was a possibility she would walk away with nothing while institutions fought over custody of something that had lived in her hands. Michelle found her one evening sitting in the guest room, staring at nothing. The music box sat on the dresser, still waiting, still keeping its secrets. "They're going to take it from you, aren't they?" Michelle said gently. "I don't know yet. Probably. There are arguments for different outcomes, but the lawyers keep emphasizing that cultural artifacts, especially ones connected to the Holocaust, they're treated differently than regular property. The moral weight overrides normal ownership rules." "That's not fair." "No, it's not." Sarah's voice was flat. "But I understand why. If these cylinders contain what they think they do, if there's music in there from composers who died in the camps, then it's bigger than me. It's bigger than whether Emma and I have a place to live or whether I can stop working 3 jobs. But you still need those things." "I know." Michelle sat down beside her sister. "David talked to someone, a lawyer who specializes in finders' rights and cultural property. She said there might be ways to negotiate. You wouldn't own the artifacts, but there could be compensation for the discovery. Museums pay finders' fees sometimes. Or if the materials have commercial value, reproductions, recordings, you might be entitled to a percentage." "Might," Sarah repeated. "Everything is might. Meanwhile, I'm living in your house, using your electricity, eating your food. And I'm grateful, Michelle, I am. But this isn't sustainable. It's sustainable for as long as you need it to be." Sarah shook her head. "I saw Emma yesterday, looking at toys in your daughter's room. Nice toys, expensive toys. And she asked me very carefully if we were poor. 7 years old, and she already knows. She already understands that we're different from you, that we don't have what other people have. I wanted to lie to her, but I couldn't." "What did you tell her?" "I told her we were going through a hard time, but that it wouldn't always be like this. I told her that sometimes valuable things are hidden, and we just have to be patient until they're revealed." Sarah laughed bitterly. "And then I thought about this damn music box, about how it might contain a fortune in historical artifacts, and how I still can't pay for my daughter's winter coat." Michelle was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Dr. Volker called David today. They're ready to open the first cylinder." "They want you there." Sarah looked up. "When?" "This weekend, Saturday morning. They've prepared a conservation chamber, assembled the team. Whatever is inside, you'll be the first to know." The laboratory where the opening would take place was not the same one where Sarah had first met Dr. Volker. This was a specialized facility, part of a university archive that dealt with fragile historical materials. The room was small, climate-controlled to precise specifications, lit with specialized lamps that wouldn't damage delicate papers. Through a window, observers could watch the process without contaminating the environment. Sarah stood in that observation room with Emma beside her, Michelle on her other side, and watched as Dr. Volker and his team prepared the first cylinder. They'd chosen one labeled Leipzig, 1936, because preliminary research suggested it might be one of the oldest, potentially offering context for the others. The team worked with excruciating slowness. First, they softened the wax seal using controlled heat, just enough to make it pliable without damaging what lay beneath. Then, with tools that looked like they belonged in a surgical theater, they carefully broke the seal and removed the cap from the brass tube. Dr. Volker tilted the cylinder gently, and something slid partway out. Paper, dark with age, rolled tightly. He used specialized tweezers to ease it free, supporting it constantly, preventing any cracking or tearing. As the paper emerged, Sarah could see writing on it, notes and text, tiny and precise. The team carefully unrolled the paper on a flat surface, using weights at the corners to hold it open without pressing down. The document was perhaps 18 inches long and 6 inches wide, covered in musical notation from edge to edge. The paper was discolored, brown in places, but remarkably intact. and at the top, in handwriting that was still clear, was a name. Miriam Adler, Dr. Volker read aloud, his voice amplified through speakers into the observation room. This is a composition by Miriam Adler, Lieder für Stimme und Klavier, songs for voice and piano. One of the other specialists leaned closer, examining the notation. I know this name. Adler was a composer in Leipzig. She studied with Karl Orff, I think, or maybe it was Hindemith. There are references to her in letters from the period, but no known surviving works. She was deported in 1941. Died in Riga. The room in the conservation chamber was silent for a moment. Then Dr. Volker spoke again, reading from annotations at the bottom of the manuscript. The text here says, "These songs were performed once, in a private home in Leipzig, March 1936. This copy was made by the composer herself, with the note." He paused, translating. "For whoever finds this, so my voice is not forgotten. M.A." Sarah felt Emma's hand slip into hers. Her daughter whispered, "Is that good, Mama? Did we find something good?" "Yes, baby," Sarah whispered back, her throat tight. "We found something very good." Over the next 3 hours, they opened 4 more cylinders. Each contained similar treasures. Compositions, some complete, some fragments. Works for piano, for string quartet, for voice. Names Sarah had never heard. But that made the specialists exchange looks of astonishment. Composers who had been mentioned in historical records, but whose music had been thought entirely lost. Pieces that represented styles and traditions that had been destroyed so completely that even describing them required reconstruction from fragmentary evidence. One cylinder contained not a composition, but a collection of folk songs, carefully transcribed with notes about their origins in small Jewish communities in Eastern Europe. The handwriting was different, suggesting multiple contributors. At the end was a message. "These songs our grandparents sang. We write them down so they can be sung again, even if we cannot." Another cylinder held a child's exercise book, musical scales, and simple pieces, annotated by a teacher. The corrections were gentle, encouraging. At the end was a note. "For my student Sarah, who had such promise. I pray she survives to continue her music." By the time they paused for a break, Sarah was crying quietly, and she wasn't alone. Michelle had tears running down her face. Emma, not fully understanding but sensing the gravity, held tightly to Sarah's hand. Dr. Volker emerged from the conservation chamber and approached them, his own eyes red. "You have given us miracles," he said simply. "Every cylinder we have opened contains irreplaceable material. This is one of the most significant discoveries of lost Holocaust-era music in decades." "What happens now?" Sarah asked. "Now, we document everything. Carefully. We continue opening the remaining cylinders. We begin the process of restoration and authentication. And then," he smiled gently, "then we bring this music back to life. We perform it. We record it. We ensure that what these people fought so desperately to preserve is heard again." "And legally? Who owns all of this?" Dr. Volker's expression became more serious. "That will be determined through proper channels. But Ms. Chen, I want you to understand something. You are not just a finder. You are a rescuer. Without your recognition of what this box might be, without your protection of it, this music would have been destroyed, thrown away as trash, burned or buried. You saved these voices. But will I be compensated? I'm sorry, I know that sounds mercenary, but I have to ask." "I understand, and the answer is complex but hopeful. These works, if they can be attributed to specific composers, may have living descendants who hold rights. But there are also finder's fees, recognition payments, potential licensing arrangements if the music is performed or recorded commercially. You will not walk away from this with nothing, though the amount and timeline are uncertain. It wasn't the answer Sarah wanted, but it was better than what she'd feared. That evening, back at Michelle's house, Sarah did something she hadn't done in months. She let herself relax. Not completely, not without the ever-present undercurrent of worry about the future, but enough to sit on the couch with Emma, watch a movie, and eat popcorn without calculating its cost per kernel. The music box sat nearby, lighter now, several cylinders removed and in professional care. But 13 remained, still sealed, still waiting. 13 more chances for miracles. Emma fell asleep before the movie ended, her head resting on Sarah's shoulder. Sarah sat in the warm house, listening to the quiet sounds of Michelle and David cleaning up in the kitchen, and thought about Miriam Adler, a woman who had known in 1936 that her world was ending, who had taken her music, her voice, and sealed it in brass and wax and wood, trusting that somehow, someday, someone would find it. Sarah had found it, in a thrift store donation bin, buried under stained linens and broken picture frames, priced at $1. And now, nearly 90 years later, Miriam Adler's voice would be heard again. The news broke 3 weeks after the first cylinders were opened, and it spread faster than Sarah could have anticipated. Dr. Volker had worked with the university's press office to craft an announcement that balanced academic precision with human interest. But once the story entered the media ecosystem, it took on a life of its own. Single mother discovers lost Holocaust music in dollar thrift store find, read one headline. Music box treasure. $733 million in cultural artifacts. Found in donation bin, proclaimed another, though Sarah had no idea where that specific number came from or whether it had any basis in reality. The details shifted with each retelling, sometimes accurate, often embellished, but the core remained constant. An ordinary person had found something extraordinary, and hidden voices were being restored. Sarah's phone began ringing before dawn the day the story went public. Journalists wanted interviews. Morning shows wanted her to appear with the music box. Documentary producers wanted to option her story. The attention was overwhelming, disorienting, and more than a little frightening. Michelle helped her navigate it, screening calls, setting up a few carefully selected interviews, declining the rest. Sarah found herself sitting across from reporters, telling the story again and again. The thrift store, the 50 cents, the moment she discovered the hidden compartment. Each time she told it, the story felt less like something that had happened to her and more like a narrative she was performing, shaped and refined for maximum emotional impact. But the interviews served a purpose. They established Sarah's role publicly, created a record that she was the finder, the protector, the person who had recognized value where others saw trash. And that record mattered when the legal negotiations began in earnest, because Dr. Volker had been right about the complications. Once all 18 cylinders were opened and their contents cataloged, once researchers began tracing the composers and searching for living descendants, the situation became labyrinthine. Some of the works could be clearly attributed to specific individuals whose families had been entirely destroyed in the Holocaust, leaving no direct heirs. Others had more complicated genealogies, with distant relatives identified through genealogical research, people who had never known their great-aunt had been a composer, or their grandfather's cousin had transcribed folk songs. The legal framework for cultural property was a patchwork of international agreements, national laws, ethical guidelines, and case-by-case precedents. Sarah sat through meetings where lawyers argued about whether these objects were abandoned property, culturally significant artifacts subject to repatriation, or individually owned works with surviving copyright implications. The language was dense, the arguments circular, and Sarah often left these meetings feeling like the actual music, the actual voices preserved in those cylinders, were getting lost in procedural debate. But Michelle's lawyer friend, a woman named Rachel Stein, who specialized in art recovery and cultural property, proved invaluable. She navigated the complexity with clear-eyed pragmatism, arguing not from emotion, but from established precedent. Her position was straightforward. Sarah had legally acquired an object, had taken appropriate steps to identify and preserve its contents, and was entitled to compensation for that discovery, regardless of the ultimate disposition of the artifacts themselves. "The music belongs to history," Rachel said during one particularly tense negotiation with representatives from 3 different institutions who all wanted custody. "But the service of preservation belongs to Ms. Chen, and that service has value." The negotiation took months. Christmas came and went, with Sarah and Emma still living in Michelle's guest room. Emma's 8th birthday arrived in January, celebrated with a small party, and a growing awareness in Sarah's daughter's eyes that their situation was both extraordinary and uncertain. The music box itself was now in the possession of the university archive, being studied by researchers from around the world, but Sarah was regularly updated on new discoveries. The contents of the cylinders proved to be even more remarkable than initial assessments suggested. Beyond the compositions, there were personal letters, diary entries, photographs that had been reduced photographically to fit inside the tubes, even a small collection of sheet music from a synagogue service, annotated with performance notes. Each item told a story of desperation, foresight, and hope. People who had known they were running out of time, who had carefully chosen what to preserve when preservation itself seemed impossible. One cylinder contained a letter that stopped everyone who read it. It was written by Friedrich Werner himself, dated December 1938, just weeks after Kristallnacht. In precise, careful German, Werner explained his process. He had been approached by families who wanted to protect cultural materials that were being destroyed or confiscated. He had designed these music boxes specifically for that purpose, creating functioning instruments that would appear ordinary while hiding extraordinary contents. He estimated he had made between 15 and 20 such boxes. He did not know how many had survived. The letter concluded with a request. "If this box is found, if its contents are preserved, I ask that the music be performed." That was always the intention. Not to hide these works forever, but to protect them until a time when they could be heard again safely. Let them be heard. Let these voices sing once more. Sarah read that letter in Dr. Volker's office, tears streaming down her face. The weight of responsibility she'd felt since the discovery deepened. This wasn't just about artifacts or money or legal ownership. This was about honoring a promise made nearly 90 years ago by people who had faced unimaginable darkness. "We will honor it," Dr. Volker said quietly. "A concert is being planned, 6 months from now, at Lincoln Center. Performers from around the world want to participate. The music from your box will be performed publicly for the first time since before the war." "My box," Sarah repeated softly. She'd stopped thinking of it as hers weeks ago, but hearing Dr. Volker say, it reminded her that in some fundamental way, this discovery was still connected to her. To the moment she'd reached into a donation bin on a cold November morning and pulled out something heavy and strange. The legal settlement came together in March, just as early spring began to soften the harsh winter. It was complex, multi-layered, and required Sarah to sign documents she didn't fully understand, even after Rachel explained them multiple times. But the essential terms were clear. The music box itself would be permanently housed in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, displayed as an example of cultural preservation and resistance. The compositions and documents inside would be digitized, with copies distributed to appropriate archives and institutions. Where living descendants of the composers could be identified, they would have rights to their ancestors' works. Where no descendants existed, the materials would enter the public domain, with academic and commercial use, governed by standard scholarly protocols. And Sarah would receive compensation. Not the $750 million that some sensationalist headlines had claimed, but a sum that, when Rachel first stated it, made Sarah's vision blur and her ears ring. "Say that again," Sarah whispered. Rachel smiled. The finder's fee, negotiated with the primary institutions involved, is $850,000. Additionally, you will receive 20% of any commercial licensing revenue generated by recordings or performances of the music over the next 25 years. Early estimates suggest that could be substantial, possibly several $1,000,000, though obviously there's no guarantee. You'll also receive recognition as the discoverer in all official documentation, museum displays, and academic publications. Sarah sat back in her chair, unable to process the numbers. $850,000. She'd been fighting over $800 in rent 6 months ago. She'd been choosing between bread and peanut butter, calculating the cost of gas to the penny, wearing shoes with holes in them because new ones weren't in the budget. "Is this real?" she asked. "It's real," Rachel said. "The funds will be transferred within 60 days, held in escrow until all documentation is finalized. You should start thinking about financial planning, tax implications, long-term stability. This is life-changing money if managed correctly." Life-changing. Sarah went home that afternoon, picked up Emma from school herself for the first time in months instead of having Michelle do it, and took her daughter to a park they used to visit before everything fell apart. They sat on a bench, sharing hot chocolate Sarah bought without checking the price first, and Sarah tried to find words to explain what had happened. "Remember the music box?" she started. Emma nodded, watching a dog chase a ball across the grass. "The people who study it, who have been looking at what's inside, they've decided that we should be rewarded. For finding it, for taking care of it, for making sure it got to the right people. Like a prize? Sort of like a prize. A very big prize. Big enough that we can get our own place to live again. Big enough that I won't have to work 3 jobs anymore. Big enough that you can have new winter coats and we can buy the groceries we want instead of just what's cheapest." Emma was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, "Will we still see Aunt Michelle?" The question hit Sarah harder than she expected. "Of course we will. She's family. But we won't be living in her house anymore. We'll have our own home again." "Good," Emma said simply. "I love Aunt Michelle, but I want our own space, even if it's small. It's just ours." Sarah pulled her daughter close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the solid warmth of her small body. "Me too, baby. Me too." Finding an apartment proved easier than Sarah expected. With proof of the incoming settlement, landlords who wouldn't have looked at her application 6 months ago now competed for her tenancy. She chose a 2-bedroom in a safe neighborhood with good schools, nothing extravagant, but clean and bright with a small balcony where she could put plants. Emma got to choose the color for her bedroom walls. She picked yellow, bright and warm, like sunshine. Moving in felt like resurrection. Sarah furnished the apartment slowly, carefully, buying quality items that would last instead of the cheapest available options. She kept her cleaning jobs initially, unable to quite trust that the money was real, that her financial situation had actually changed. But eventually, with Michelle's gentle pushing and Rachel's practical advice, she gave notice to her employers and allowed herself to breathe. The breathing room revealed how exhausted she'd been. For months, Sarah slept 10 hours a night, her body recovering from years of chronic stress and insufficient rest. She gained weight back, filling out the hollows in her face and arms. She laughed more easily. Emma, watching her mother transform, became lighter herself, less careful, more willing to be a child instead of a small adult, constantly monitoring her parents' mood. But Sarah didn't forget. She couldn't. Every time she walked past the thrift store where she'd found the box, she felt a complicated mixture of gratitude and sorrow. Gratitude for her changed circumstances, for the security she could now provide Emma. Sorrow for everyone else still inside that struggle, still counting pennies, still scrubbing other people's houses for minimum wage. She started volunteering at a local community center, helping adults navigate social services and financial assistance programs. She donated to food banks, women's shelters, organizations that helped single mothers. She set up a small scholarship fund in Emma's name for children of single-parent households. The money gave her choices, and she chose to remember what it felt like to have none. The concert at Lincoln Center happened in September, exactly 10 months after Sarah had found the music box. Dr. Volker arranged for Sarah and Emma to attend, with seats in the orchestra section, close enough to see the performers' faces. Michelle and David came too, along with Rachel Stein and several of the researchers who had worked on the project. The program was extraordinary. Miriam Adler's songs for voice and piano, performed by a soprano whose voice filled the hall with aching beauty. A string quartet piece by a composer named Jacob Weiss, whose entire family had been killed in Treblinka. Folk songs from villages that no longer existed, sung by a choir in Hebrew and Yiddish. A piano sonata that had been incomplete when it was sealed in the cylinder, but which a contemporary composer had finished, working from the original's themes and style. Before each piece, a narrator provided context. The composer's name, their life story as far as it could be reconstructed, the circumstances under which the work had been created and preserved. Photographs were projected on a screen behind the orchestra, images of the composers when they were young, vibrant, full of the future they didn't get to have. Sarah watched and listened, tears streaming freely down her face. Emma sat beside her, unusually still, absorbing something she was perhaps too young to fully understand, but old enough to feel. This was what the music box had contained. Not just notes on paper, not just historical artifacts, but voices. Human voices, singing across decades, reaching forward from darkness into light. During intermission, Dr. Volker found Sarah in the lobby. "How are you holding up?" "I don't have words," Sarah said honestly. "This is overwhelming. Come with me. There's someone who wants to meet you." He led her through the crowd to a quiet corner where an elderly woman sat in a wheelchair, attended by a younger woman who appeared to be her daughter. The elderly woman's eyes were alert, intelligent, fixed on Sarah as she approached. "Miss Chen," Dr. Volker said, "this is Ruth Adler Brenner. She is Miriam Adler's niece, the only surviving member of that branch of the family." Sarah's breath caught. She knelt beside the wheelchair, bringing herself to Ruth's eye level. "I'm so honored to meet you." Ruth's hands trembled slightly as she reached out to take Sarah's. Her grip was stronger than expected. "You found my aunt's music. You saved her voice. I never thought I would hear it. My mother spoke of Miriam constantly, told me stories about her talent, her kindness, her determination to compose even when it became dangerous. But there were no recordings, no surviving scores. She was a ghost, a memory of a memory. And now?" Sarah asked gently. "Now she lives again?" Ruth's eyes filled with tears. "You gave me back my aunt, not just her music, but proof that she existed, that she mattered, that her life had meaning beyond the way it ended. Do you understand what that means to someone like me, to have family restored from absence? Sarah did understand, perhaps more than Ruth knew. She'd spent years feeling erased herself, invisible in her poverty, irrelevant in her struggle. The music box hadn't just changed her finances. It had given her proof that she could matter, that her actions had consequences beyond her own survival. "Thank you," Ruth said simply. "Thank you for seeing value where others saw trash. Thank you for being the person who recognized that something broken could still be precious." The concert's second half included the premiere of a new work commissioned specifically for this event, titled Songs the Frost Wrote. A contemporary composer had used themes from all 18 cylinders, weaving them together into a single composition that honored the originals while creating something new. It was haunting, powerful, a conversation between past and present, between loss and recovery. The final notes faded into silence, and for a long moment, the audience sat motionless. Then the applause began, rising like a wave, filling the hall with sound. The performers stood, acknowledging the ovation, and then the conductor turned and gestured toward Sarah's section. A spotlight found her, and suddenly 2,000 people were applauding her, standing, recognizing the woman who had found the music box. Sarah stood awkwardly, overwhelmed, Emma pressed against her side. She hadn't expected this, hadn't wanted this kind of attention. But as she looked around at the faces, at Ruth Adler Brenner clapping from her wheelchair, at Dr. Volker beaming with pride, at Michelle crying openly, Sarah understood something fundamental. This wasn't just her story anymore. It never had been. It was everyone's story, a testament to the fact that preservation was possible, that voices could survive even when everything else was destroyed, that broken things could be made whole again. The months that followed brought continued revelations. Researchers traced the woman whose estate had yielded the music box, the elderly woman who had died with no family to claim her belongings. Her name was Helen Kohler, and she had emigrated from Germany in 1939 at age 17, sponsored by a distant relative in America. She had worked as a seamstress, lived quietly in the same apartment for 50 years, and died at 97, with almost no possessions beyond the essentials. But among her papers, found in a safe deposit box she'd maintained for decades, was a letter, written in German, dated 1938, from her father. He had entrusted her with the music box before she left, made her promise to keep it safe, to never open it, to pass it on to someone who would understand if she did not survive to see Germany freed. Helen had kept that promise for 79 years. She had protected the box, kept it hidden, never opened the cylinders herself because her father had told her not to, and when she died, having no one to pass it to, the box had entered the anonymous stream of estate liquidation. It had been thrown away because Helen Kohler had kept her promise too well. She had told no one what the box contained, had left no instructions, had allowed it to become just another object to be disposed of when her apartment was cleared. She saved it, Dr. Volker said when he showed Sarah the letter. For almost 80 years, she saved it, even though she never knew exactly what was inside. And then you saved it again. This is a story of preservation across generations, Sarah. Your role is the final link in a chain of protection that spanned nearly a century. Sarah had the letter translated and framed. It hung in her apartment. A reminder of Helen Kohler's quiet heroism, of the promises people keep even when no one is watching, even when the cost is a lifetime of unknowing. The money continued to arrive in increments as the commercial aspects of the discovery unfolded. The first recording of the music box compositions became unexpectedly popular, selling beyond anyone's projections. The story resonated, apparently, in a world hungry for narratives of survival and recovery. Sarah received checks every quarter, smaller than the initial settlement, but still substantial. Money that she invested carefully for Emma's future, for her own security, and for the causes she'd chosen to support. She was approached about writing a book, about participating in a documentary, about a dozen other projects that wanted to capitalize on her story. She declined most of them, accepting only those that kept the focus on the music and the composers rather than on her. This wasn't about her heroism. It was about Miriam Adler and Jakob Weiss and the unnamed transcribers of folk songs. It was about Friedrich Werner and Helen Kohler. It was about everyone who had fought to preserve beauty in the face of destruction. 2 years after finding the music box, Sarah stood in the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., attending the official opening of an exhibit dedicated to the music box and its contents. The box itself was displayed in a climate-controlled case, lit carefully to prevent deterioration, surrounded by explanatory text, photographs, and reproductions of some of the documents it had contained. Emma, now 9, stood beside her, reading the plaques with serious concentration. She'd grown taller, more confident, flourishing in their stable life. She took piano lessons now, showing an aptitude that made Sarah wonder if music was somehow in their family, passed down through generations in ways neither of them fully understood. "Mama, look," Emma said, pointing to a panel near the end of the exhibit. It was titled, "The Finder, Sarah Chen," and it contained a photograph of Sarah from the Lincoln Center concert, along with text describing her discovery, her protection of the box, and her role in bringing the contents to light. Sarah read the description, which Rachel had helped review for accuracy. It was fair, neither aggrandizing nor diminishing. It positioned her as she wanted to be positioned, as someone who had been paying attention at the right moment, who had recognized value, and who had made sure that value was preserved. "That's you," Emma said unnecessarily. "That's me," Sarah agreed. "Are you proud?" Sarah considered the question. Pride felt complicated, tangled up with everything that had come before the discovery, with the poverty and desperation that had led her to that thrift store on that particular day. But yes, beneath the complication, there was pride. Not in herself exactly, but in what the discovery had accomplished, in the music that was being performed, in the voices that were being heard again, in Ruth Adler Brenner's joy at recovering her aunt's legacy. "I'm grateful," Sarah said finally, "and I hope I did right by everyone involved." "You did," said a voice behind them. Sarah turned to find Dr. Volker, older now, his hair whiter, but his eyes as sharp as ever. He'd become a friend over the past 2 years. Someone Sarah trusted to tell her the truth, even when it was complicated. "The research continues," he said, gesturing at the exhibit. "We've identified 3 more Werner boxes in private collections, owners who had no idea what they possessed. Your discovery opened the door for others to come forward, to have their own family objects examined. We estimate there may be as many as 8 boxes still surviving, possibly more. Each one contains materials we thought were lost forever." "Because of a $1 music box in a thrift store," Sarah said softly. "Because you looked," Dr. Volker corrected. "Because when everyone else saw garbage, you saw possibility. That is the lesson here, Sarah. Not that miraculous discoveries are common, but that attention matters. That caring about things, even broken things, even things that seem worthless, that caring can change everything." They stood together, looking at the display, at the music box that had transformed so many lives. Sarah thought about the moment she'd first touched it, the cold weight of it in her hands, the decision to spend 50 cents she couldn't afford. She thought about all the choices that had led to that moment, the job loss, the financial collapse, the move to the cheap apartment, the Thursday trips to the thrift store. Every piece of her struggle had positioned her to be in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. "What are you thinking?" Dr. Volker asked. "I'm thinking that sometimes the worst parts of our lives are what prepare us to recognize the best parts. If I hadn't been desperate, I wouldn't have been in that store. If I hadn't been looking for anything valuable, I might not have seen the box. My poverty, as much as I hated it, as much as it hurt, it put me in position to find this. And I don't know how to feel about that." Dr. Volker nodded slowly. "Life is not a story with clean morals. But perhaps the meaning is this: no experience is wasted if it teaches us to see clearly, to recognize value, to understand that preservation is always worth the effort. You learned those lessons in hard circumstances, yes, but you learned them. And because you did, all of this," he gestured at the exhibit, at the music box, at the recovered voices, "all of this became possible." That evening, Sarah and Emma had dinner at Michelle's house, a weekly tradition they'd maintained even after moving into their own place. The conversation was easy, comfortable, filled with the small details of ordinary life. Emma's piano recital next month, Michelle's daughter's upcoming graduation, David's new project at work. But after Emma and her cousin ran off to play, Michelle poured wine for the adults and asked the question Sarah knew was coming. "Are you happy? Really happy?" Sarah thought about it, taking her time with the answer. "I'm not struggling anymore. That's a form of happiness I never want to take for granted. I can pay my bills, buy groceries without panic, give Emma what she needs. That's enormous. But sometimes I think about all the people still in the position I was in 2 years ago. All the single mothers scrubbing toilets, all the families 1 emergency away from eviction. And I wonder why I got out and they didn't. What makes me special? Why did I find the music box when thousands of other people walked past that donation bin and saw nothing?" "Luck," Michelle said simply. "Terrible, arbitrary, unfair luck. You can't fix the whole system, Sarah. You can only do what you can do. I know. And I am. The volunteering, the donations, the scholarship fund. But it never feels like enough." Michelle reached across the table and took her sister's hand. "It's not supposed to feel like enough. The world is too broken for any one person to fix. But you're doing more than most. You're using what you found to help others. That matters." Later that night, back in her own apartment, Sarah sat on the balcony with a cup of tea and looked out at the city lights. Emma was asleep in her yellow bedroom, safe and warm, and dreaming whatever dreams 9-year-olds had. Inside the apartment, everything was paid for, secure, stable. The life Sarah had fought so hard to build for them. She thought about the music box, about Miriam Adler and Friedrich Werner and Helen Kohler. She thought about the chain of protection that had preserved those voices across decades, across continents, across the absolute darkness of the Holocaust. Each person in that chain had done what they could. Werner had built the boxes, the families had hidden them, Helen had kept her promise, and Sarah had recognized what she'd found and made sure it reached people who could honor it properly. None of them had solved everything. The Holocaust had still happened. Millions had still died. The music preserved in the cylinders, as beautiful as it was, couldn't change those facts. But it could add something back. It could say that erasure was not complete, that some voices survived, that beauty could outlast horror if enough people cared to protect it. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Volker. He sent these occasionally, updates about the project, or just messages of connection. This one contained a link to a video, a high school orchestra performing Miriam Adler's songs, translated and adapted for young musicians. The performance was imperfect, enthusiastic rather than polished, but the comments beneath the video were filled with young people discovering this music for the first time, asking questions, wanting to know more. This, Sarah thought, was the real measure of success. Not the money, not the recognition, but this. The music spreading, reaching new audiences, being performed by people who had no connection to the original tragedy, except their humanity and curiosity. The voices were being heard again, and they would continue to be heard, because Sarah had spent 50 cents on something broken and had cared enough to find out why it mattered. She finished her tea and went inside, checking on Emma one last time before bed. Her daughter slept peacefully, one arm thrown over her stuffed rabbit, her face relaxed in the complete trust of a child who knew she was safe. Sarah stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her breathe, feeling the weight of everything that had changed. 2 years ago, she'd been counting pennies, choosing between bread and peanut butter, sleeping on a mattress on the floor with an eviction notice on her door. Now Emma had a yellow bedroom and piano lessons, and a future that extended beyond next month's rent. The transformation was staggering when Sarah allowed herself to really see it. But the transformation wasn't just financial. Sarah herself had changed. She'd learned that her attention mattered, that her choices had weight, that she could affect the world in ways she'd never imagined. The music box had given her more than money. It had given her proof that caring about things, even broken things, even things everyone else dismissed, could change everything. She thought about Werner's letter, his request that the music be performed. "Let these voices sing once more," he had written. Sarah had made that possible. Not alone, not without help, but she'd been the crucial link. Without her, those cylinders would be in a landfill now, destroyed, without anyone ever knowing what they contained. As Sarah finally went to bed, she thought about the morning ahead. She'd volunteer at the community center, helping other women navigate the systems she'd barely survived herself. She'd deposit another quarterly check from the music licensing. She'd pick up Emma from school and maybe stop for ice cream, a small luxury that still felt remarkable in its ordinariness. The music box had changed her life, yes, but more than that, it had shown her that transformation was possible, that the worst circumstances could contain hidden treasures, that attention and care and willingness to see value where others saw nothing could alter the course of not just one life, but many. Somewhere in Germany, nearly a century ago, a man named Friedrich Werner had built a box to preserve voices that were being silenced. In America, decades later, a woman named Helen Kohler had kept a promise she'd made to her father, protecting something she never fully understood. And in a thrift store donation bin on a cold November morning, Sarah Chen had reached past the obvious garbage and found something extraordinary. The chain of preservation had held, the voices had survived, and now they sang again, echoing through concert halls and school orchestras and museum exhibits, reaching forward into a future that Werner and Kohler and all the composers had hoped for, but never lived to see. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the softness of sheets she'd bought without checking the price, breathing air from a heating system that worked perfectly, resting in a home that was truly hers. The frost had written her unfinished songs, yes, but spring had found them. And they were more beautiful than anyone could have imagined. 3 years after the discovery, Sarah received an invitation that made her hands tremble as she opened the envelope. The letter was printed on heavy cream paper, embossed with an official seal she recognized from her research, the Berlin State Opera. Inside, written in both German and English, was a request for her to attend a special commemorative concert marking the 80th anniversary of Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass that had shattered Jewish communities across Germany and Austria. The concert would feature exclusively music recovered from the Werner boxes, including substantial pieces from Sarah's discovery. The German government was officially recognizing the music boxes as cultural heritage objects of international significance, and they wanted Sarah present as an honored guest. All expenses paid, accommodations for her and Emma included, and if she was willing, a brief speech about the discovery. Sarah sat at her kitchen table, reading the invitation 3 times, her coffee growing cold beside her. Emma, now 10 years old and showing the first signs of approaching adolescence, looked up from her homework. "What is it, Mama?" "We've been invited to Germany, to Berlin, for a concert." Emma's eyes widened. "The music box concert? The one Dr. Volker mentioned?" "Yes." Sarah set down the invitation carefully, as though it might dissolve if handled too roughly. "They want us there. They want me to speak." The thought terrified her. Speaking at Lincoln Center had been overwhelming enough, but that had been in her own country, in a language she spoke natively, surrounded by people she'd come to know through the authentication process. This would be different. This would be standing in Germany, in the country where the music had nearly been erased, speaking about preservation and survival to an audience that included survivors and their descendants. "Are we going to go?" Emma asked. Sarah met her daughter's eyes, seeing excitement there, curiosity, the natural adventurousness of a child who'd grown up with stories of the music box woven through her understanding of the world. Emma had been 7 when they'd found it, old enough to remember their poverty, their struggle, but young enough that those memories were already fading, replaced by the stability and security that had defined her life since. "I think we have to," Sarah said slowly. "I think this is part of finishing what we started." The decision made, Sarah threw herself into preparation. She worked with a speech coach, crafting remarks that balanced personal narrative with historical weight. She researched the history of Kristallnacht, reading first-hand accounts that left her shaken and grateful that such darkness felt distant from her own experience. She studied the other Werner boxes that had been discovered since hers, learning about the families who'd commissioned them, the materials they'd contained, the different paths each box had taken through the decades. Dr. Volker called regularly, helping her prepare, offering encouragement. "You belong there," he insisted during one conversation. "You're not an outsider to this story, Sarah. You're part of its continuation. These people want to thank you, to honor what you did. Let them." Michelle helped Sarah shop for appropriate clothes, insisting on buying her sister a dress that would photograph well and make her feel confident. "You're going to be in newspapers," Michelle said practically. "International newspapers. Let's make sure you look like someone who knows her worth." The worth comment stuck with Sarah. 3 years ago, she'd felt worthless, ground down by poverty and failure, invisible in her struggle. The music box hadn't just given her money, it had given her proof that her attention mattered, that she could affect the world in meaningful ways. She was still learning to inhabit that knowledge, to believe it fully. The flight to Berlin was Emma's first time leaving the United States. Sarah watched her daughter press her face to the airplane window during takeoff, marveling at how small everything became, and felt a bittersweet ache. This opportunity, this adventure, it came from such a tangled knot of circumstances. Their poverty had put them in that thrift store. Sarah's desperation had made her notice a broken music box. The worst period of her life had positioned her to find something extraordinary. She didn't know how to reconcile those facts. The music box had saved them, yes, but she wouldn't wish the journey on anyone. The sleepless nights, the constant anxiety, the shame of accepting charity from her sister, the way Emma had learned too young to be careful about asking for things. Those experiences had shaped them both in ways that wouldn't fully reveal themselves for years. Berlin surprised Sarah with its beauty and its visible history. The hotel where they stayed was in the former East Berlin, a neighborhood that showed layers of the city's past in its architecture and street layout. Their guide, a young woman named Greta, who worked for the State Opera, took them on a walking tour the day after they arrived, letting them adjust to the time change while introducing them to the city. "Here," Greta said, stopping in front of a building that looked modern compared to its neighbors. This was rebuilt after the war. The original structure was destroyed completely. And here, she pointed to a gap between buildings, now a small park. This was never rebuilt. They left it empty as a memorial to what was lost. Emma, holding tightly to Sarah's hand, asked quietly, "Why did they destroy everything?" Greta knelt to Emma's level, her expression serious but kind. "Because hate made them want to erase a people completely. Not just hurt them, but make it as if they'd never existed at all. Buildings, businesses, books, music, everything that said, 'Jewish people made this,' or 'Jewish people lived here,' they wanted it gone. But it didn't work," Emma said, "because of people like Mama, who found the music." "Exactly," Greta said, smiling. "It didn't work because enough people refused to let it work. People who hid things, protected things, and people like your mother, who recognized what they'd found and made sure it was preserved." That evening, Sarah met with the concert organizers and several of the descendants of composers whose works had been recovered. The gathering was held in a private room at the Opera House, intimate and emotional. Ruth Adler Brenner was there, having made the journey from New York despite her advanced age, determined to hear her aunt's music performed in the city where Miriam had lived and composed. "Sarah," Ruth said, gripping her hands with surprising strength, "you must meet someone." She introduced Sarah to a man in his 80s, tall and dignified despite his years. "This is Martin Weiss. His grandfather was Jakob Weiss, whose quartet piece was in your box." Martin Weiss studied Sarah with eyes that seemed to see through surfaces to something deeper. "I never knew my grandfather," he said, his English accented but fluent. "He was deported before I was born. My father spoke of him rarely. The loss was too painful. When Dr. Volker contacted us about the quartet, about the music you'd found, my father was still alive. 93 years old, living in a care facility, his mind mostly gone. But we played him a recording of the quartet, and he wept. He couldn't speak anymore, but he wept. And I knew he remembered something, recognized something of his father in that music." Sarah felt her throat tighten. "I'm so sorry for your loss, for your family's loss." "Don't be sorry," Martin said firmly. "Be proud. You gave my father a final gift, the chance to hear his father's voice again, even if only in music. That is not a small thing, Ms. Chen. That is everything." The concert itself was held on November 9th, the exact anniversary of Kristallnacht. The symbolism was deliberate, transformative. A night that had been about destruction would now also be remembered for preservation, for the music that had survived, for the voices that refused to be silenced. Sarah sat in the opera house, Emma beside her in a new dress, and felt the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. The hall was packed, every seat filled, with standees at the back. The audience included survivors, descendants, diplomats, musicians, historians, and ordinary Berliners who'd read about the concert and wanted to be present for this moment. The program opened with a speech from the Minister of Culture, a woman who spoke movingly about Germany's responsibility to remember, to preserve, to ensure that such darkness never repeated itself. Then Dr. Volker took the stage, and Sarah saw him as she'd never seen him before, not as the careful academic she'd worked with, but as a man who carried his own history of loss and survival. "I was born in 1948, Dr. Volker said, his voice carrying clearly through the perfect acoustics of the hall. "My parents were survivors. They did not speak of what they had endured. Not to me, not to my siblings. The silence was how they survived after surviving. But they made sure I knew this. Culture matters. Art matters. Music matters. Because these things are what make us human. And when someone tries to destroy a people, they always start by destroying the culture first. He paused, looking out at the audience. The music you will hear tonight was meant to be destroyed. It was created by people who knew they were running out of time, who understood that the world they lived in was ending. They could have given up, accepted erasure. Instead, they preserved. They sealed their voices in brass and wax and wood, trusting that someday, somehow, someone would find them and understand their value. Dr. Volker turned slightly, gesturing toward where Sarah sat. That someone was Sarah Chen, a single mother in America, struggling to feed her daughter, who saw a broken music box in a thrift store and recognized possibility. What she found saved not just music, but memory. She saved proof that these composers existed, that their lives had meaning, that erasure is never complete if even one person cares enough to look. The applause was thunderous. Sarah felt Emma squeeze her hand, felt tears sliding down her own cheeks, and made no attempt to stop them. This was what the music box had meant all along, she realized. Not money, though the financial security mattered immensely. Not fame, though the recognition had its value. This moment, this gathering of people honoring voices that had been meant to disappear forever. This was why it mattered that she'd spent 50 cents on something broken. The music began. Miriam Adler's songs, performed by the same soprano who'd sung them at Lincoln Center, her voice now even richer with experience and understanding. Jakob Weiss's quartet, played by musicians who'd studied the manuscripts for months, learning the language of a composer they'd never heard of until the box was opened. The folk songs, sung by a choir that included descendants of the communities where those songs had originated. Between pieces, actors read from the letters and diary entries that had been preserved in the cylinders. Personal words from people long dead, brought back to life in the mouths of performers who understood the weight of what they were speaking. A father's advice to his daughter, a teacher's encouragement to a student. A love letter that had never been delivered. Small human moments preserved against impossible odds. During intermission, Sarah was approached by more descendants, more historians, more people who wanted to thank her or share their own stories of recovery and preservation. A woman whose grandmother's poetry had been found hidden in a wall during a building renovation in Prague. A man whose great-uncle's paintings had been discovered in a warehouse in Argentina, stolen by Nazis, and then abandoned when the theft became too dangerous to acknowledge. A teenager whose school project about the music box had sparked her interest in becoming a historian herself. Each story added another layer to Sarah's understanding of what she'd been part of. The music box wasn't unique in its purpose or its survival. It was one example among thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, of people refusing to accept erasure, finding ways to preserve something of value when everything was being taken away. Her discovery had been important, yes, but it was important as part of a larger pattern of resistance and survival. The second half of the concert included the world premiere of a new composition, commissioned specifically for this evening. A German composer, herself the granddaughter of survivors, had created a piece called Unsealed that wove together themes from all the recovered Werner box materials into a single hour-long work. It was challenging, modern, sometimes dissonant, but threaded through with moments of piercing beauty that made Sarah's chest ache. The final movement included a recorded element, something Sarah hadn't been warned about. As the orchestra played, a projection appeared on the screen behind them. film footage, scratchy and damaged from before the war. Jewish communities in Leipzig, Berlin, Vienna, markets and synagogues and street scenes, children playing, couples walking arm in arm, musicians performing in cafes. Ordinary life that would soon be destroyed utterly. And then, over the orchestra, voices, recordings that had been recovered from various archives, digitized and restored. People speaking, laughing, singing in Yiddish and German. Not the famous or the important, just ordinary voices, the kind that history usually erases without comment. The music swelled around them, supporting them, ensuring they were heard. Sarah understood what the composer was doing. These voices, these images, they were context for the music. They were a reminder that the compositions preserved in the cylinders weren't abstract art. They were extensions of lives, of communities, of a world that had been vibrant and complex before being reduced to historical tragedy. When the final note faded and the lights came up, the audience sat in absolute silence for a long moment. Then someone stood. Then another. Within seconds, the entire hall was on its feet, applauding, many people openly weeping. The ovation lasted nearly 10 minutes, waves of appreciation and grief and recognition washing over the performers who stood on stage, visibly moved. Sarah was called to the stage for her remarks. Emma stayed in her seat, watching with wide eyes as her mother walked down the aisle and climbed the stairs to stand at the podium, where Dr. Volker and the Minister of Culture had spoken. The lights were bright, hot, and Sarah could barely see the audience beyond the first few rows. But she could feel them, hundreds of people waiting to hear what she had to say. She'd prepared remarks, practiced them until they felt natural. But standing there, looking out at this gathering in this city on this anniversary, her prepared speech felt inadequate. She set her notes aside and spoke from the heart instead. 3 years ago, she began, her voice steadier than she'd expected. I was broke, not struggling, not getting by, actually broke. I was cleaning other people's houses for minimum wage, living with my daughter in an apartment we couldn't afford, counting pennies to buy bread. I felt invisible, like my life didn't matter, like I could disappear and the world wouldn't notice or care. She paused, collecting her thoughts. I went to a thrift store on a Thursday, because that's when they marked down items that hadn't sold. I was looking for a winter coat for my daughter. Instead, I found a broken music box that cost 50 cents. I almost didn't buy it. I needed that 50 cents for food. But something made me look at it more carefully, made me think maybe, just maybe, there was value there that other people had missed. Sarah glanced toward where Emma sat, finding her daughter's face in the crowd. When I found the hidden compartment, when I saw those sealed cylinders, I didn't know what I had. I just knew it mattered. I knew someone had worked very hard to preserve whatever was inside, and that seemed important enough to protect, even though I had no idea what it would mean. She turned back to the full audience. I'm not a hero. I want to be very clear about that. I'm just someone who was paying attention at the right moment, who made one good choice in a long string of desperate choices. The real heroes are the people who created this music, who sealed it away, knowing they might never hear it again. Friedrich Werner, who built boxes to save culture when culture was being destroyed. Helen Kohler, who kept a promise for 79 years. These are the people who deserve recognition. Sarah's voice thickened with emotion. But standing here tonight, listening to this music performed in this city where so much was lost, I understand something I didn't 3 years ago. Every act of preservation matters. Every person who chooses to look carefully, to recognize value, to protect something beautiful or important or true. Every one of those people is part of a chain that connects past to future. We don't have to do something dramatic to matter. We just have to pay attention. We just have to care enough to look past the obvious and see what's really there. She gripped the podium, steadying herself. The music box changed my life, yes. It gave me financial security I'd never imagined. But more importantly, it taught me that I matter. That my choices have weight. That even when I felt invisible and powerless, I had the ability to affect the world in meaningful ways. And if my story can teach anyone else that same lesson, then maybe that's the real treasure the box contained. Not just the music, as precious as it is, but the reminder that we all have the power to preserve, to protect, to ensure that what matters survives. The applause when she finished was different from what the music had received. It was personal, warm, full of recognition and solidarity. Sarah returned to her seat, feeling lighter, feeling like she'd finally said what needed to be said about the discovery and her role in it. After the concert, a reception was held in the Opera House's grand foyer. Sarah found herself surrounded by people wanting to talk, to share stories, to make connections. Emma, tired but happy, stayed close to her mother's side, occasionally adding her own observations with the unself-conscious wisdom of children. Ruth Adler Brenner found them as the crowd was beginning to thin. She looked exhausted but radiant, decades younger than her years. "This is the last concert I will attend," she said without preamble. "I'm 97 years old. I know my limitations. But I heard my aunt's music performed in the city where she composed it. I heard her voice restored. Because of you, Sarah Chen, I received that gift before I died." She pressed something into Sarah's hand, a small box, wrapped simply. "Don't open it now. Wait until you're home. But know that it's a gift from my family to yours, in gratitude for what you've done." Sarah tried to protest, but Ruth silenced her with a gentle hand. "You gave me back my aunt. Let me give you something small in return. Please." The flight home 2 days later felt dreamlike. Sarah and Emma sat in their seats, Emma sleeping against her mother's shoulder, Sarah staring out at clouds that looked solid enough to walk on. The wrapped box Ruth had given her sat in her carry-on, still unopened. Sarah was almost afraid to look, afraid the emotion of the gift would overwhelm her before she was ready to process it. Back in their apartment in America, back in the life that felt simultaneously ordinary and miraculous, Sarah finally opened Ruth's gift. Inside was a photograph, clearly old, preserved with care. It showed a young woman at a piano, her face turned toward the camera with a slight smile, her hands poised over the keys. On the back, in careful handwriting, Miriam Adler, Leipzig, 1933. Below the photograph was a handwritten letter from Ruth. "This is the only photograph of my aunt I possess. My mother brought it when she escaped, carried it through hell, protected it when everything else was being destroyed. Now I give it to you, so you can see the face of the woman whose voice you saved." Miriam was 28 when this was taken. She had her whole life ahead of her. She should have grown old, composed hundreds of pieces, taught generations of students. She didn't get that chance. But because of you, her voice survived. Her music will be performed, recorded, studied. You gave her the immortality art is supposed to provide. Thank you, from the bottom of my family's heart. Ruth. Sarah held the photograph gently, looking into Miriam Adler's eyes across 9 decades, and felt the full weight of what she'd been part of. This woman, young and talented and doomed, had trusted that her music mattered enough to preserve. And she'd been right. Against all odds, despite everything designed to erase her, Miriam Adler's voice had survived. Emma, watching her mother, asked softly, "Are you okay, Mama?" Sarah nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Then she said, "I'm thinking about chain reactions, how one thing leads to another in ways we can't predict. Miriam composed her music. Werner built the box. Miriam's family sealed the music inside. Helen Kohler protected it for decades. Someone donated it to a thrift store. I found it. Dr. Volker authenticated it. Performers learned it. Ruth heard it. And now you, Emma, you've grown up knowing this story, understanding that preservation matters. Who knows what you'll do with that knowledge? What you'll choose to protect or preserve or recognize?" Emma considered this seriously. "I want to be like you," she said finally. "I want to be someone who sees value where other people don't." Sarah pulled her daughter close, holding her tightly. "You already are, baby. You already are." The years that followed brought continued reverberations from the discovery. More Werner boxes were found, each containing its own treasures. The music from Sarah's box was performed regularly, recorded by major orchestras, studied in music schools. Sarah's finder's fee percentage continued to generate income as the recordings sold and performances multiplied. She invested carefully, ensuring Emma's future, while also supporting organizations dedicated to cultural preservation and Holocaust education. She returned to Berlin twice more, building friendships with the people she'd met at that first concert, becoming part of a community dedicated to recovering and preserving cultural materials from the Holocaust. She learned that her role wasn't finished when she'd found the box. It continued in her willingness to share the story, to encourage others, to look carefully at the objects in their own lives, to understand that history was not abstract, but contained in physical things that needed protection. Emma grew, as children do, carrying the music box story with her as a foundational narrative of who she was and where she'd come from. She understood, in ways Sarah hoped would serve her well, that value could be hidden, that attention mattered, that the power to change things often came not from dramatic action, but from careful noticing and persistent care. The music box itself remained in the Holocaust Memorial Museum, viewed by thousands of people every year. Each visitor learned about Werner's boxes, about the families who'd commissioned them, about the chain of preservation that had protected these voices across decades. And each visitor, Sarah hoped, left with the understanding that they too had the power to preserve, to protect, to recognize value even in broken things. Years later, when Sarah was asked to write the foreword for a book about Werner's preservation efforts, she concluded with words that captured everything she'd learned. "The frost wrote her unfinished songs. Yes, winter buried them deep. But spring found them because someone was paying attention. Because someone believed broken things could still be precious. Because someone understood that the cheapest items sometimes contain the most valuable treasures. And because of that attention, that belief, that understanding, voices that were meant to be erased forever now sing again. That is not a miracle. That is what happens when we choose to see clearly, to care deeply, and to protect what matters. That is what happens when we refuse to let anything or anyone be forgotten." Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.